Good evening and welcome tonight to St. Augustine's Catholic Center and Randall Catholic as we present Rachel Killackey. My name is Father Chase Hasner. I'm the pastor here, and it's great to have each and every one of you join us tonight. I'm very touched and moved that so many of you would come out to this evening and hear a talk about a fairly serious topic, pornography. It's not the easiest thing to perhaps want to look into. It's not maybe the easiest thing to come into a room and acknowledge and have other people see you that you want to hear about this topic. But I can tell you, as a priest for the last 13 years, probably the greatest threat to our society and the greatest threat to the gospel is pornography. It's a pandemic, full stop. I remember in 2002, when I was a freshman at Gonzaga, hearing about theology of the body. And I don't know exactly what Rachel will be speaking about tonight, but I know when I heard about the beautiful teachings of sexuality that the Catholic Church offers, it was incredibly freeing. I think as destructive as pornography can be, on the other side, I've seen a tremendous amount of peace and freedom from those who are able to put it in a rearview mirror and to really have control over it rather than having it have control over them. So about a year ago, as many of you might know, we offer annual great debates, and I thought this is something we need to debate because more and more I was hearing that pornography is actually fine, that it's healthy, that it's good. And I thought this is not what I think, but maybe if someone wants to argue it, we can have a good, healthy debate. And we looked far and wide nationally for someone who would publicly defend pornography, and we could not find them. Happily, we found someone who would speak about the threats of it. And so here we are tonight, welcoming Rachel Killackey. I'm going to let Nicole, our campus minister, introduce her, and then we'll hear from Rachel herself. So welcome, Rachel.
Beautiful. Thank you guys for coming. A few practical notes before we get started. If you need the bathroom, don't use this door. Go around to the back and through the student lounge for the bathrooms. There's another door there just to make sure that it's like we're giving full attention. Second, we're going to be doing questions two different ways at the end. So you should have gotten a piece of paper when you walked in. You can write your question on that piece of paper and we'll do a basket that goes around once Rachel's talk is over. Or you can ask your question live, one of the two. Good note is we won't be recording the questions. We're just going to be recording the talk. So once the questions get started, they won't be recorded. But to introduce Rachel, Rachel is the founder and executive director of Magdala, a nonprofit organization that offers community and resources to women struggling with sexual addiction. Magdala Ministries serves over 1,000 women in 37 different countries. She earned her bachelor's and master's degrees in theology from Ave Maria University. Rachel married her husband, Tommy, in 2021, and they now live in Tampa, Florida, with their daughter. Her book, Love and Recovery, is available through Ave Maria Press. This is Rachel's first time in Idaho, so please help me give her an extra special welcome to Rachel Killackey.
Is it on?
Yeah. It's on when I lean down. Can you hear me? Is this working?
Yeah.
Yes? Okay. Me with cords and mics is unpredictable at best. How are we doing, guys?
Exceptional.
Yeah. Stoked to talk about porn. Me too. Always. A few years ago when I was starting my nonprofit work in this topic, I gave a small Theology on Tap to a crowd of about 12 people, like literally 12. And I just remember hearing, the woman came in late and she came and sat in the front row and like leaned over quietly next to her friend. She's like, "Hey, what's the topic again?" And her friend leans over, she's like, "Porn." And then the friend leans over and she goes, "But she's a girl." So I began speaking on this topic when I was a junior in college because no other girls were. That's kind of case in point, right? I started my first recovery group for women seeking healing from pornography addiction when I was a senior in college. And then I founded Magdala, my organization, several years ago. But all in all, I've been working on this topic in one way or another for about 6 years now, which is super joyful. It's a deep well of joy in my life. I'm excited to share it with you. But yes, I am a girl, and I am talking about porn because this is not a guy's issue or a gal's issue. This is a human issue, right? My life, my story is a testament to that. And now, because of my work, I've seen pornography as an affront to human dignity, both personally in my own life and professionally in the lives of thousands of women and men. Pornography addiction was a battle in my life for about 5 years when I was an adolescent. So I was exposed when I was 13, which statistically is actually quite late. The average age for guys is 9, the average age for girls is 11 to be exposed to pornography. But I entered sobriety by the grace of God as a sophomore in college. So it's been many years now. And now I help women battle it daily. So I get to encounter my story and face off with it, or as Father would put it, look in the rearview mirror of my life every single day. And just get to see what the Lord has done for me. So there's a lot of misconceptions surrounding women and pornography addiction. So I'll just give you a couple stats to have in your back pocket for the next time you're in this discussion at the bar. Or your average Catholic at middle party, who knows. Women actually make up at least a third of porn addicts. That was a study from 2014, so I can only imagine it's more now. One recent study in 2020 actually said that 60% of women admit to using pornography. 60%. It's 90% of men, which probably won't come as a surprise, but 60% of women. So again, this is a human issue, so I'm glad we're all here together in our common humanity, not men versus women. But thanks for hearing my perspective. Another thing I hear about a lot, other than just misconceptions, because of my work, is just excuses around porn use. Father pointed out a few of them, just that this is okay, this is healthy. But perhaps the most common one that I hear is, this only affects me. This only affects me, it doesn't affect everyone. It's private, right? And even when we're talking about the legal fight against pornography, it's the right to privacy that protects it. I hate this excuse. I think it's bullshit, to be honest. Well, pardon my French, but I just do. But believe me, I've heard them all at this point. And I think when we're navel-gazing like this, we miss what porn is doing both to us as individuals and what it's doing to our culture. And I think I have to tell you that we're living in an incredibly over-sexualized, sexually damaging, destructive culture, right? And I think porn is at the heart of that, truly, for men and for women. As Father said, this is a sensitive topic, so I'm guessing that pornography is a reality for many of you, whether in your own lives or the lives of people you're close to. And so whether we encounter it through a porn site, a book, a movie on Netflix at this point, if we're being honest, it's something that, as Justice Potter Stewart said there's this famous 1964 Supreme Court case where you probably heard it, but when asked what pornography was, he said, we know it when we see it, right? And now we're seeing it all the time, so we can no longer know it, right? Slipping past us. Maybe you're recalling some things right now that you shouldn't have watched, listened to, read, right? We are so inundated with it that we can't even identify it anymore. That's how bad it's gotten. You used to have to walk to a store with your hood up, right? And walk into this specific store for pornography or order it through the mail. And now it's in your back pocket. It's horrifying. So yeah, I'm going to talk about that tonight. I'm going to talk about what having it in our back pockets has done to us. And maybe what we can start to do about that. Because I believe that healing pornography's presence in our culture starts with healing its presence in our own lives first. And I think sometimes we think maybe we've taken care of it, but we haven't. You know, I still encounter many places in my life where porn is still having the final word, and it shouldn't, right? Even though I'm completely sober, I'm very careful about what I consume, careful about what I watch. I'm a happily married woman. I still hear its voice sometimes. And I think we all do. whether or not it's a part of our story specifically. Dr. Gerald May is a Christian psychiatrist, or was a Christian psychiatrist. He passed several years ago, but he wrote an incredible book on spirituality and addiction called Addiction and Grace. I highly recommend it, especially for those of you who are pursuing any sort of ministry, mission, social work, psychology. He's a really great resource on the reality of addiction in the Christian life. He talks about these 5 hallmarks of addiction, which when I read them, it really clicked in my own life and in my work. And he talks about how we can be addicted to anything, and these 5 hallmarks will show up, whether that's porn, food, alcohol, sugar, caffeine, whatever it may be, right? But I think these 5 hallmarks, the more and more I think about them, are not just hallmarks of a personal addiction, but the hallmarks of an addicted culture, which is what we're in. So I'm going to go through those symptoms and just talk about how they affect us as individuals and how they're affecting our culture. So the first symptom of an addiction is tolerance. Tolerance. Tolerance is a bit of a cultural buzzword right now, right? We think it's a good thing, or at least it's portrayed as mostly a virtuous thing. But when it comes to addiction, it's far from virtuous. So on a personal level, tolerance means that the more we consume porn or engage in any sort of sexually compulsive behavior, whether that's masturbation, fantasy, interpersonal sex outside of marriage, it means the more we engage in that sexually addictive behavior, the more we need of it in order to achieve our high, right? And there are a couple different highs associated with sexual addiction. Some people consume it to dissociate from their pain, to numb from pain. So it's not about climax, it's about numbing. I know I fell into that camp. I was trying to dissociate from trauma. That's why I consumed pornography, right? But I'm not a neuroscientist, so don't give me credit where I don't deserve it. So, and forgive my reductionist explanation, but essentially our brain circuits become less and less sensitive over time. The more and more we consume something that produces dopamine, the less and less receptive our brain actually is to that dopamine, right? So the more and more we actually need to consume in order to get the dopamine through to those receptors, right? We become more and more tolerant of what we're seeing. And so sometimes that means we need to consume more quantities, or that means we need to consume more extreme things, right? And many people begin in the world of kind of pornography addiction. Many people begin with consuming what they think is innocent or close, right? Like, oh, it's just a TV show, right? This is fine. It's just a book. This is fine. Everybody else is reading it. It's fine. Everybody else is watching it. It's fine, right? You think it's relatively harmless, and you think you can stay there, but you rarely do. Rarely. And it will escalate, whether quickly for some people, slowly for others, depending on your individual addiction timeline, right? It escalates. And typically our tolerance of pornography leads to the need for content that includes violence. It's one of the biggest hallmarks of an escalated porn addiction, is the consumption of violent content. There's a 2010 study that's really disheartening, but it studied popular porn content, and it found that nearly half of porn scenes include verbal aggression, and 90% of violence in porn videos is directed at women. Right? Women are the victims typically. And I found for men, this creates a disordered sense of domination and power. And for women, it creates this ongoing lie of perpetually being the victim. A lot of women are coming, especially women in my organization, they're coming to us with stories of deep violence, deep abuse, and they relive that through the consumption of violent content. So violent content is not off limits for women. In fact, it attracts them. For very different reasons, perhaps, than men. But it escalates for everybody. So an addicted individual who's experiencing tolerance begins to consume content that they would otherwise be abhorred by. Sorry, words are hard. Abhorred by in their daily life, right? And this leads to increased shame, increased isolation, which then leads to more consumption. Shame and isolation feed that addiction cycle. And this is how child pornography has infected our culture, right? I believe that a majority of people who end up falling into child porn consumption would have never imagined themselves in that place, right? but because of an escalating need for content. That's how they end up there. So people who tolerate violence, people who tolerate aggression, people who tolerate verbal humiliation even, and evil in their pornography, and thinks that it just affects them, that creates a culture that's desensitized to violence and aggression and humiliation in their everyday, right? The more we are desensitized to violence through our private consumption, the more we become desensitized to it when we see it. There's some interesting research from several studies on pornography's effect on what's called bystander intervention. So that's if you see something criminal or violent occurring on the streets, your likelihood to respond by calling for help, your likelihood to intervene in any manner. So several studies actually suggest that the more entrenched in porn consumption someone is, the less likely they are to intervene in a violent occurrence in their everyday life. Why? Because we're used to it, even entertained by it, right? And research also suggests that porn consumers are more likely to victim blame sexual violence survivors. We're more likely to be suspicious of victims of assaults. We're more likely to be suspicious of victims of abuse, to doubt their stories, right? And I'm a fan of truth reigning in every situation, right? But as somebody who walks daily with abuse victims, nothing is more invalidating than not being believed. And nothing is more freeing than being believed, right? So this is important. Victim blaming is destructive. Porn consumers are also more likely to imitate sexually violent behavior in their interpersonal sex lives. Even against somebody they love, right? Especially against somebody they love. Neuropsychologist Donald Hebb coined the phrase, "What fires together, wires together." It's a simple phrase that's easy to remember. What fires together, wires together. And he's referring to the brain's neural pathways that we were talking about earlier, but those pathways are forged through repetition. And if we continue to associate violence with entertainment or violence with worse pleasure, right, with that dopamine release, we can't just keep those associations to our private life. They echo into our public life as well and into our culture. I also don't think I need to make it clear to you that we have been steadily becoming a culture that tolerates evil. Violence, right? Towards women, children, marginalized communities, the unborn, right? And it begins with what we tolerate watching privately. I really believe that. And it affects those that we interact with. It affects our respect for them, right? It affects our ability to have peaceful sexual relationships with those that we love. It affects our ability to be upstanding citizens and intervene, right? And so, in order to become a culture that does not tolerate evil anymore, we have to become a culture that does not tolerate porn. Plain and simple. The second hallmark of addiction that Dr. May lays out is withdrawal. This is perhaps one that we could easily recall when we're thinking about addiction, but the symptoms of personal withdrawal can be very varying, and they can also be both physical and mental, right? So here's a caffeine addict. Raise your hand. Don't be ashamed. This is a safe space. Yeah, me too. I had 4 cups of coffee today. So not talking about coffee addiction tonight. When you don't have it, what do you get? A splitting headache? Yeah, me too. That's a symptom of physical withdrawal, right? Or tiredness, fatigue, physical withdrawal. So it's our body literally reacting to the distress of not engaging in a behavior that we have found comfort in, that we've had that dopamine release with, that we've become dependent on. So our brain and body in withdrawal quite literally think they're in danger, even if the behavior or the substance that we're consuming is harmful to us. When we're without it, our body thinks we're in danger. So it reacts. When we're trying to enter recovery from a sexual addiction, withdrawal can look like fatigue, it can look like depression, it can look like anxiety. I had heightened anxiety during my recovery. It can look like panic. And yeah, I've had women even experience physical symptoms like headaches or different things like that. It can be also understood as kind of like a rebound reaction. If we're used to experiencing a ton of hits of dopamine, that makes sense that we would just turn to lethargy, right? What's the opposite reaction? Or depression instead of a high. Some clinicians also, this is important, they like to sort addictions into two categories, behavior or substance. Sexual addiction is a really contentious discussion in the addiction world, in the psychological world. People don't want to type it as an addiction, I think because of ethical right to privacy, right? But there are some experts in the sexual addiction fields that think it should be both, categorized as both. It's both a behavioral addiction and a substance addiction. We're addicted to both what we're consuming and the process of finding it. It's interesting. And this makes the withdrawal symptoms sometimes even more complex for those recovering from sexual addiction. So we have to not just let go of the content, we have to let go of the behavior, right? One of my friends, when she was giving up smoking cigarettes, she had to roll paper between her fingers. Maybe some of you have had to do this, right? Because it wasn't just the smoking, the nicotine that she was addicted to. It was the habit of pulling a cigarette out, rolling it between her fingers, smelling it, all sorts of stuff. So she would have to roll paper between her fingers for about 6 months until she was able to let it go. So withdrawal is strange, and we have to do a lot to get out of it, to fight it. And withdrawal from porn can be incredibly severe, despite what we may think. And it can vary in severity depending on how long you've been consuming, what you've been consuming, what your timeline is. But whatever the personal timeline is, you will experience some symptoms of withdrawal. And sometimes that withdrawal is strong enough to keep you coming back. There was a 2020 study that said 91% of men, I cited this a bit earlier, and 60% of women reported consuming porn in the last week when this study was taken, in the last week. I can only imagine that number is growing. I know that's really hopeless, but we'll get to the hope in a little bit, I promise you guys. If we're a culture where men and women are consistently consuming, that means we're a culture where men and women are consistently experiencing withdrawal. It's this volley back and forth, consumption, withdrawal, right? And that withdrawal doesn't just have physical and mental effects, it has spiritual ones. We become withdrawn into ourselves. We cannot focus on meaningful work. We cannot focus on meaningful relationships. We cannot pursue God's will, right? And so a culture that is withdrawn cannot build itself up, can't expand, can't grow, can't become virtuous. It cannot connect. We see alternate forms of connection pervading our consciousness, right? Pervading our social lives and experiences because that's who we're becoming. We're becoming people who need an intermediary, a phone between us, a screen between us to connect because we're so unable to without it. Our social worlds, our culture's on crutches right now when it comes to engagement. On crutches. And we're consistently anxious, depressed, angry, desperate for anything other than being alone with ourselves, right? We reach for entertainment. In the end, it only leaves us more alone with ourselves, ironically. So a culture that allows and even defends porn and encourages its consumption is a culture that allows the slow and painful collapse of the human person into itself, which is perhaps the most painful of collapses, right? There are several theologians that talk about how hell is just being alone with oneself for eternity. Facing off with yourself forever. Whereas heaven is communion, right? We're made for communion, we're not made for isolation. And so if you want a culture that encourages relationships, that encourages engagement, that encourages communion with each other and with God as much as we can possibly have on this earth, we have to become a culture that rejects withdrawal. Specifically the withdrawal that comes from pornography and its consumption. And the spiritual ramifications that withdrawal has on our souls. The third hallmark of addiction is called self-deception. Self-deception. Addicts become self-deceptive because they have to cover their tracks, quite simply. Their core, they know their behavior is harming themselves and others, We're made in the image and likeness of God, and one of the most beautiful things about that's having an intellect, right? Whether or not we tap into it, it's a huge gift. And at that center of the intellect is written the command simply to do good and avoid evil, as Thomas Aquinas puts it, right? Do good, avoid evil. And that can never be completely snuffed out. Never. Even if it's like shrunken down into just like a minute form of itself, that code is written in us by dint of being human beings. And so in order to continue our addictive behavior, we lie to ourselves and we lie to others. Anna Lemke is a psychiatrist who wrote an amazing book called Dopamine Nation, which I would highly recommend reading. And she calls this self-deception the lying habit, because she says every addict she's treated has the lying habit. And she says it can begin just as simply a way to cover up your own addiction, but it can fester into an addiction itself, where you become intrigued by your power, your ability to deceive, right? I had several of these moments of like feeling that thrill of the truth being in your hands, right? I had a lot of self-deceiving mantras when I was struggling. As a devout Catholic, I told myself that I knew not to do what I was watching or reading in real life, so it was fine. It's a really lame excuse, right? But that was a self-deceiving mantra. Or, I can quit whenever I want is probably the most common. Like, I'll give it up today, right? Can we believe it when we see it? These are self-deceiving tactics that just justify us in partaking in our behavior just one more time. And one more time turns into one more time, and one more time, and one more time, right? And that's how we stay in our pattern. And we have to cover up that trail of endless one more times. And again, that leaves us isolated and leaves us feeling really alone. But we have spouses or significant others that we hurt by our porn consumption. We have employers and friends that we can betray. And we have a God who's always with us, always sees us. And like he asked Adam in the garden, he says, where are you hiding? Why are you hiding? And we can never totally hide from him, but man, do we try. And so these lies just tend to take on a life of their own, even if they seem small at first. And so people who consistently lie because they're compelled to by addiction create a culture that treats the truth as its plaything. I don't think I have to convince you that that's what our culture is doing now too. Relativism, I feel like we've gone even beyond relativism, right? Where it's offensive to think something is true, objectively true. So when we're used to deception or even addicted to it, we spread this attitude, right? That the truth is what I make it. The truth is about what protects me, about what makes me feel good. And a porn-addicted culture is one that ultimately does become relativist because it has to in order to survive. There truly is no, like when you're looking at legal cases over pornography, there is no defense for it other than relativism. We don't have the right to tell somebody what is healthy for them. I've looked at endless court cases. I know, it's a little nerdy, but I did. I've looked at endless court cases, and that's the only defense. It's relativism, right? We have to justify ourselves to ourselves over and over and justify ourselves to other people. Because the other option is giving up our addiction once and for all, and that's hard. It's difficult, and so we hide from it. And when it comes to porn addiction, the options truly are living in the truth, facing off with the reality of ourselves, or keeping it around. You can't have both. And that's what those self-deceiving mantras do. They keep us kind of fluctuating between both, thinking we can have it all. And so to be a culture that honors truth and the integrity we are called to by being made in the image and likeness of God and having an intellect, right? We have to become people that no longer do anything we feel we must hide and lie about. We have to become people of truth and reject the lies of self-deception that come from addiction, specifically to pornography. I'm almost through all the symptoms, I promise. The fourth symptom of an addiction is called loss of willpower. Loss of willpower. So addicts of any kind, no matter how much they want to stop, can't by their own volition. I saw this in my own life, right? In order to recover, you need some sort of outside assistance that can be as minor as an accountability partner, as major as a rehab program, right? Some sort of outside assistance is necessary to help you. When an addiction is present, it is not enough just to want to quit anymore. You have to have somebody else want you to quit and help you. So similar to tolerance in a culture of people who have lost their willpower, we have a culture of people who no longer know what strength or freedom are. Our will is behind our freedom. And to compromise our will is to compromise one of the greatest gifts, again, that God has bestowed on us in creating us. C.S. Lewis put it really simply. He said, when God created us, he gave us himself and he gave us ourselves. He gave us himself and he gave us our very selves. We get to have possession of ourselves and live in freedom when surrendered to Christ, right? Our free will was created for many things, but it was ultimately created so that we could freely love and give ourselves, first to God and then to others. And so when we sacrifice our willpower for the sake of consuming pornography, we lose the ability to use it to its full capacity, to use it in that blessing, right? We can no longer commit to the things that give life its meaning. We cannot commit, if we don't have willpower, we cannot commit to relationships. We cannot make decisions with confidence. We can't discern God's will for our lives, right? We cannot learn the saint-making art of suffering and loving well because both of those take willpower. And oftentimes they're the same thing, right? And they take willpower. We cannot become anything without our willpower, quite simply. The late Pope Benedict XVI, who is an absolute dog, right? He wrote, nothing threatens our life more than the failure to be with our true being. I'm going to say it again. Nothing threatens our life more than the failure to be with our true being. When we deaden our will, we can give our consent to nothing, including God's will, right? Benedict XVI continues. He says, it's this failure to be with your true being which allows the promise of life to evaporate, leaving only banalities and leading to final emptiness. When we can't consent to God's will, we cannot become who we are. And our will is one of the most distinct things that separates the living from the machine. The fact that we have the freedom to choose, right? And in it, we find that locus of freedom, because ultimately freedom is about giving yourself to the right things. We find the freedom to be real, to live in reality. And so to be a culture that is free to follow God's intention in creating us, free to become who we are, we have to be a culture that rejects pornography's claim upon our willpower. And that means kicking it out of our lives, right? Gerald May's final criteria for an addiction is called distortion of attention. Distortion of attention. This goes beyond mere distraction, because we all experience distraction, right? And though addiction certainly causes perhaps more proliferated distraction, when we're addicted to pornography, our attention can be so enraptured by it that we become preoccupied by it. Again, kind of against our will in moments where we desperately want to focus on something else. Even when we're not consuming porn, we can be thinking about it. It can be still affecting us. Memories and images can haunt our subconscious, or we can allow our minds to create new images and fantasize about whatever we want based on the content we've consumed. And it's not hard to find a sexual trigger nowadays. Just flip on Netflix, right? Or look outside on a billboard. Pull up Instagram. It's everywhere, right? And so trying to redirect our attention over and over usually fails. We become exhausted by it without God's help, right? And so when our attention is so damaged by porn, we find that our ability to give weight to conversations, to people, to their dignity is damaged. We cannot be attentive to them. We make other men and women just fodder for our imagination. We use them in ways they will never know. And so again, it doesn't just affect you, even if you think it's private. It affects who you're interacting with. And lust does not have boundaries. It doesn't care who becomes an object as long as it has one. It has no respect for you or for another person. And we already live in a world where there is something constantly competing for our attention, right? I saw one stat that said something like we see 276 ads in a day. That's a lot of ads, right? Or that there are 96 words competing for our attention per 5 seconds. Whether that's like on Simon's go through, everybody's like looking around like, are there 96 words in this room? But you get my point, right? But attention is a non-renewable resource because it's inherently related to time, right? Attention is a function of time. It's a non-renewable resource. And so once a moment is gone, it's gone forever, and your attention in that moment is on what it is on forever. And what we give our attention to matters, and we do seem to have lost some awareness of that because we spend hours scrolling or glazed over in front of a screen for what? TikTok? Why? Why? Why is it more important than the people that are right in front of us? And I'm just as bad about this as the next person, probably worse, right? I don't have TikTok. Praise be Jesus Christ, now and forever. But I have my other distractions, right? But we have to ask ourselves, with these things that we're spending so much time on, why is it deserving of that time and attention? Not just pornography, these other things. Because when our attention becomes distorted, it affects every aspect of our daily life. Without our attention, we cannot really live. We can't be dedicated students. We can't be dedicated professionals, spouses, friends, family members, right? We cannot relate. We cannot love. We cannot do if we first cannot pay attention to what is going on around us. And so a culture ripe with pornography addiction is one that does not fight back when its time is ripped away. That's what porn does. It rips your time away, your non-renewable resource. When I look back at the time I lost to pornography, I'm saddened because what could I have been spending my time on? But I hope I make up for it now. But also, what saddens me most is that a culture rife with porn or an individual rife with porn consumption is one that cannot pray. Without our attention, we cannot pray. And again, I'm not saying we aren't distracted. Like, if you have found out how to be completely undistracted in prayer, please come find me after this. Tell me your secrets. Because I haven't gotten there yet, right? But individuals who allow their attention to be distorted and exploited, right, are unable to create a lasting connection with anyone, including themselves, but especially their God, right? Without our attention, we lose the ability to be with our Creator, to commune with Him, to call to mind His presence and reflect and meditate and worship. We could even say we worship what our attention is on, right? So attention is a treasure. And where our treasure is, so also our hearts will be. What are we worshiping when we allow porn addiction to steal our attention from us? Right? However often. So in order to become a culture that is attentive to the needs of others, a culture that can love, a culture that ultimately worships the one true living God who is deserving of all our time and attention, we have to take back our attention from the grip of pornography. So, yeah, if you're struggling with porn right now, talks like this are a little distressing, right? I remember sitting in many talks about like the information of pornography's harms that left me feeling scared and ashamed. And that's not my intention tonight, but we do have to know the harms in order to know exactly what's being done to us. And yeah, I left many talks feeling like the worst of mankind, right? And that's also a tactic of the enemy to like point at you and say, your sin is the worst sin, you know, but ironically he's saying that to everyone, right? We can be so caught up in our addiction that we forget that there's anybody else worth fighting for, and so shame is another way to stay caught up. So if you're feeling shame right now, just ask that you release it. And this leads me to my final point. If you are in porn's grip right now, or part of your story still is, and you haven't received healing, get all the help you need to stop. Get every ounce of help out there available to you that you feel called to pursue. Not just because porn creates a tolerance of evil, or because it creates withdrawal into our own selves, or ongoing deception and offense to truth, or self-deception, right? Not just because it causes a loss of our God-given freedom to choose the good and takes our precious time from us, because yes, it does all those things, as I've pointed out, and it does that to our culture. But you should get help to stop using porn because you are worth more than that. Your life, your time is worth more than that. So again, we can get so caught up in the harms we're doing to other people, but think of you. You beautiful creature of God, you. You are worth more than that, right? The young people that we encounter who are just so entrenched, right? Whether that's our peers, people we're working with, whatever, they are worth more than that too. They need examples. And Scripture instructs us to love our neighbors as ourselves, and so we cannot love and serve our neighbor if we don't first love and serve ourselves. Put your oxygen mask on before assisting others, right? I heard that on 3 different flights today. And I was like, that relates to my talk. No. Kind of. That's kind of what I did. But you know what I mean? Get help. Can't tell you how many times I sported that Fight the New Drug, Porn Kills Love t-shirt when it was killing my love behind the scenes. Get yourself some help. You deserve it. Begin recovering, and it happens slowly, and it's okay that it happens slowly. But begin recovering because you don't want to tolerate evil, because that's not what your heart is made for, because you have gifts that your community needs that withdrawal will steal from you, right? Because you deserve to live in the truth. You deserve to freely love and freely give. Because ultimately we all have one life. One. And porn does not deserve your life. It really doesn't. And by God, it won't have it. It really won't. If you're sitting in a talk like this, oof, yeah, porn does not have the final word. But finally, recover from porn, right? And help our culture recover. Because our human dignity means that eternity is written on our very souls. That's where we're meant to go, right? And as St. Augustine said, our hearts are restless until they rest in Him. Porn is a symptom of the world's restlessness. So give them the real answer. Give yourself the real answer, right? And when you're entrenched in it, and when other people are entrenched in it, it feels all-consuming. So if you feel all-consumed right now, I get it. But I entreat you to believe that instead of being consumed by porn, you are consumed by the love of a God who crossed heaven and earth and space and time to get you your heart back. That's the final word. And He'd do it again. So as I said at the beginning, in order to create a culture that rejects the counterfeit of porn, we have to first look at our own hearts. We have to heal our own hearts and ask God to create a clean one in us. And again, that's a long, drawn-out process. Pope John Paul II has a beautiful poem on Mary Magdalene, and he has one line that just I think of all the time. He says, "It takes long, truth sounding out error." Truth sounding out error. Porn fills us with a lot of error, and it takes time for truth to sound that out. That's okay. Be gentle with yourself, right? But that counterfeit has to be rejected first and foremost from within. And only then can we actually begin to restore the dignity of our culture. Thanks for listening, guys. That's all I got.
So if you guys have questions,